This podcast details true crime cases. It contains adult themes and may contain descriptions of violence. It is not intended for children. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you for joining me for today's episode of Once Upon a Crime. In Season 1 of this podcast, I released a series titled Sweetheart Killers, where I presented cases of couples who are forever linked to one another for both love and murder. In that series, I detailed the case of Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate. In 1958, 19-year-old Starkweather went on a killing spree that shocked the nation. He took his 14-year-old girlfriend, Caril, with him. The story of that crime spree has become a legend in true crime history, and Starkweather and Fugate have been portrayed as villains on par with Bonnie and Clyde. In this episode, I revisit this case by speaking with best-selling true crime author Harry MacLean. In his new book, Starkweather, The Untold Story of the Killing Spree That Changed America, he takes a comprehensive look at this case and comes to some new conclusions about Caril Fugate's guilt or innocence in the murders. Harry MacLean has been one of my favorite true crime authors since I first read his Edgar Award-winning true crime book, In Broad Daylight, in the late 1980s. In Broad Daylight was made into a television movie in 1991 and was Harry MacLean's first book. I have really been looking forward to speaking with Harry about his new book and getting his perspective on the Charles Starkweather case. Let's go now to that conversation. So I am talking with author Harry MacLean, and I'm very excited about this for a couple of reasons. One, because I am a big fan of your books. I have been for a long time. And so when they asked me, do you want to, interview this author? And I'm like, of course. How is that possible? Because In Broad Daylight, that was one of my all-time favorite true crime books. I'm a big true crime book reader. And also Once Upon a Time, which was the Eileen Franklin case. So I know how detailed you get in these books and how much research you do. And I've always been a big fan. So first of all, I just want to thank you and welcome you to the show.
It's my pleasure to be here, and thanks for the compliments. I always like dedicated readers.
Yeah. So, okay. So the first thing, I found out a couple of things about you besides the books that you've written, but also your career. So you had a distinguished career as an attorney and a law professor before you became a best-selling author. And these kind of things always intrigue me because when somebody maybe takes a different path than maybe they had planned to. Of course, this may have been something you always wanted to do. I don't know. That's what I want to know. Before you became a best-selling author of these nonfiction crime books, and also, I found out just recently, a novel. So how did you transition from that career that you had previously in law to becoming an author?
Well, I kind of, to back up a little bit, I kind of reached the end of the path that interested me in law. I was general counsel of the Peace Corps in the Carter administration. I'd been deputy attorney general and many jobs like that in the public sector. A couple years in the private sector. After about 15 years, the old dream that most lawyers have is I'm going to write a book. And the only thing I'd written other than legal stuff was a short story in college. And I kind of kept telling myself, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do it. And then came across this story in Northwest Missouri where they had killed a town bully after he had terrorized them for 20 years, killed him on the main street of town, and there had been no prosecutions. And I thought, that's it. That's the story for you. And I drove across the plains one day and drove into town, and 5 years later, I had a book published. And I didn't switch completely from one to the other. I kept working as an arbitrator, which is like a private judge in civil and labor disputes. So I kind of did that and supported myself somewhat while I was looking for true crime stories that appealed to me. So I kind of kept both of them going. One's left brain, the other's right brain, but I was able to get them to connect for quite a while.
That's amazing to me because that was your first book, and that was a bestseller. It, I believe, was turned into a television movie. Is that correct?
Television movies. It was a single movie to NBC, and it starred Brian Dennehy as the bad guy, as the bully, and he did a great job. It also had Marcia Gay Harden and Cloris Leachman in it. It was an excellent show, and actually you can find it on YouTube today.
That had to be kind of a little bit mind-blowing. Your first book, it gets this kind of attention, but it was so good. And also that case was just so wild. Like, it was just something that you're like, I can see why that maybe drew you to want to tell that story, just the whole circumstances behind it. But the question I also have so was it true crime kind of stories? Was that always like something you were interested in, or was it just that story in particular that grabbed your attention?
Well, I was affected by a lot of people by In Cold Blood, and we know that that's now called narrative nonfiction or the nonfiction novel. Right. That struck me quite hard. I had both a legal reaction to it and kind of a personal reaction to it, and the mixture of bringing the law down on human behavior really appealed to me. Of course, I always wanted to write a novel. Everybody wants to write a novel, it seems to me, at one point or another in their life. But the true crime thing kind of fit my personality and fit my interests because it had the legal structure in it and how that functioned, how it operated. But also under the nonfiction novel rubric, you're allowed some discretion, some flexibility in how you present the story. You can use fiction techniques in it. Mm-hmm. It's not just a straight newspaper story. So that mixture of those two appealed to me.
Yeah. I think that's probably why I like your writing so much, because it does read like a novel, but it's true. And obviously very, very detailed as far as the research. Like you said, the first book took you 5 years. So, it's not just something you read a couple articles and dash off. There's a lot. And I want to get to your new book because of that. So Starkweather, your new book, has it been released yet?
Yeah, it was released actually a week ago today on the 28th.
This book is a comprehensive look at the 1958 spree murders committed by 19-year-old Charles Starkweather. Now, this case has become almost like folklore in true crime history. And the questions I have first about this, it's a 65-year-old case. And what compelled you specifically to want to write about this case? And also, the second part of that question is, was it difficult to research a crime that happened so long ago? I mean, I know there's a lot about it, but was it still the details that you were trying to get for this, something maybe that we didn't know about or hadn't heard before? Was that difficult to find?
Your first question is why now is an interesting one, and I don't think there's a quick answer to it or an easy answer. But Starkweather, first of all, he was accompanied by his girlfriend, Caril Fugate, who was 14 at the time. He was 19. And that has been their crime spree, which involved 10 murders over Nebraska and Wyoming in January 1958, has been romanticized by movies, Badlands, and Murder in the Heartland was a series that did it, and songs. Bruce Springsteen wrote a song, an album called Starkweather, and the song on there is quite powerful.
Jumping in for a quick correction. Harry just misspoke here. He knows very well, as do I, and probably you, that Bruce Springsteen's album is titled Nebraska.
And books. There have been 12 books written on it. So it is a part of the lore. And my sense was, second of all, the romanticism of it was one reason I was pulled to it. Because they've done kind of a Bonnie and Clyde with the two of them. Mm-hmm. And that's it's not a romantic adventure at all. It was a bloody, cruel, vicious spree. And that's the way it needs to be looked at in history, and in my view anyway. Mm-hmm. And the second of all was that I'm from Lincoln. I knew some of the victims of Starkweather. My brother went to school with Starkweather. Mm-hmm. I knew where he grew up. I knew where he hung out. So I had a feel for Nebraska. In 1958, I was a couple years younger than Charlie. So the setting was really familiar to me. And I think the setting is a big part of the impact of the story because it's the heartland. It's Lincoln, Nebraska. It's not LA or Brooklyn or the Bronx or something that you think of with a lot of street crime or that sort of crime. And so it was a shock that way. And I wanted to tell the story, take the romanticism out of it. What were the facts? And I wanted to push it further than it had been pushed. It's an easy story to exploit because Starkweather looks kind of like James Dean. Caril was 14, cute, a little rough. So it made good optics, to use today's language. And so the fact that I was from there, and over the years, I'd kind of walked up to it several times in between other books and thought, I ought to write that story. And I kind of veered away from it. And the reasons for that are kind of complicated, but it was going to be a personal journey for me, let's put it that way, if I did it, because I was going to go back into my own boyhood there. And so I kind of veered away from it. And then one day, February 2020, Caril Fugate, Charlie, just as a factual matter, was executed in the electric chair 15 months after his conviction in 1958. Caril was tried in the fall of 58, found guilty of felony murder and sentenced to life in prison. So she got out after 17 years, and she's alive today. And in February 2020, she had applied for a pardon in 2018. It was turned down in February of 2020. And that, I saw her on the clips on TV, and that's what really caught my interest, because I looked at her for the first time and said, we really don't know what this girl did. We don't know. She was convicted. Yeah, a jury found her guilty, but no one has ever really looked at her guilt or innocence in these 10 murders. Mm-hmm. And, I do that for a living. I said, I was a juvenile court magistrate judge earlier in my career. As an arbitrator now, I sort out questions like guilt or innocence. Mm-hmm. What for a living? I mean, for what happened here? Who's telling the truth between these two people? So I thought I'm going to bring those skills to the question of Caril Fugate's guilt or innocence, mm-hmm. which, like I say, had never really been thoroughly investigated. And so that was kind of the hook that got me into it. Was I'm going to take a look, because I've heard about her obviously for years, and I know that everyone thinks she's guilty. Mm-hmm. Law enforcement thought she was guilty. The newspapers convicted her with almost no evidence. So that's why I got into it, and it is kind of the beginning. If you say why is it important historically, it's, in my view, he's the first mass murderer in modern America. Mm-hmm. And by that, I mean television America. People in 1958, television had just hit when the Starkweather spree happened, and the two of them connected in a way that we live with today, the effects of the connection between violence and television. It's an unholy alliance. It's extremely powerful. It's extremely popular. I mean, look at what's on TV every day and in the movies and in the books. And this is where it started. There weren't really any mass murderers like Charlie prior to 1958. And this kind of, in my view, kicked off the whole mass murder scene that we're living with today. I won't go into all the reasons behind that, but that's a main theme in the book. So if there's any validity to that theme, it needs to be explored as something that contributed to these constant, almost daily mass murders that we've learned to live with today. Yeah, it was a problem. I was 6 years old. Almost everybody was dead. And that would have, if I had done it earlier, that wouldn't have been quite the problem it was. There were a lot of documents, a lot of trial transcripts. There were memoirs. The people that were alive when it happened, that were mainly children or teenagers, there were a lot of those people around to talk about the impact of it. But the guilt or innocence issue really did rely on documents, a lot of which had never been, had not seen the light of day before, which was real helpful to me. And one of the problems was that, both of them had trials, both Caril and Charlie had trials, and the evidence was missing. I mean, the evidence in the trials was by and large missing. They had the rifles and some other items, purses and wallets and photographs and so forth. But the critical evidence in particularly Caril's trial was gone. And I would have to go into a long explanation and say what that evidence was, but it was critical to determining her guilt or innocence. And, I went to the police department, Supreme Court of Colorado, county sheriff, all those places, and none of them had it. And it's that's what really made life difficult, because some issues would have been greatly impacted had I been able to see the evidence in the trials.
Huh. That's interesting that it was missing. I mean, I know that happens, but this is such an infamous case, and it was such a big story. Even then, you would think that would be preserved.
Yeah. I think one of these days they're going to tear down an old annex in Lincoln, and it's going to be found in some boxes in the basement.
Yeah.
That's the way these things, turn up. I doubt that it was actually thrown out. It's just some clerk at some point said, I'm going to stick these things over there, and I'm not going to mark the boxes. And that's where they are, but I couldn't find them.
Yeah. Give them over here with the Christmas decorations or something. What is this box? I don't know.
Exactly.
Just stick it over there. Yeah.
Exactly.
Gosh, that's crazy. Yeah, that had to be a little bit frustrating. One of the things about the book that I noticed is that you have the accounts. I think it was Charlie's account, and Charlie's accounts, they changed. And Caril's seemed to stay somewhat the same when they explained what happened, or the details of what happened. What you've stitched together in the book are first-hand accounts of the murder spree from both Charlie's side and then alternately Caril's side. And I was just, wondering, why did you choose to present it that way? And what did that inform you about once you did?
Well, let me just back up a little bit. The first murders were of Caril's mother, stepfather, and little sister. Mm-hmm. And it's pretty clear that Charlie killed all three of them, although he debates that later on. But the question always was Caril there when he murdered her parents? And there's a lot of reasons why that's important, which is another area. But then it goes on, and they go out to another small town, and he kills one of his friends, and then they're picked up by when they're hitchhiking, and there's two people are killed there, and it kind of goes on from there. And the problem was, I wrote it, and my editor said, no, you have to put the reader in the car with the people. They've got to feel the story. They got to feel the atmosphere and the killing and all that stuff. And I said, well, I can't do that because there's two different versions for every murder, and I can't resolve them. If I try and resolve them in the course of describing them, it's going to be boring as hell. So she said this, he said that. So I thought, well, I'll just tell it from each side. Each murder from each perspective, and it'll help me develop not only the story, but the personalities of the people as you see how they describe these murders. And you're right, Charlie initially confessed to all the murders and said Caril had nothing to do with it. And Caril has always taken the position that she was a hostage. Charlie then changes his story and starts implicating Caril in various of the murders. And the story keeps evolving as time goes on and he goes to trial, until by the time Caril comes to trial, she's gone from not having anything to do with anything to being responsible for 3 murders. And so you kind of had to keep the stories separate that way, and it's kind of like a Rashomon thing. Kind of depends what it looks like, depending where you're where you're standing. And it was actually kind of interesting to write it that way because I could place them right next to each other and see how they evolved.
So that's the thing. I think sometimes people forget the age difference. Like he was 19, so legally he was an adult. She was 14, and they had this ongoing relationship for a while. At least it was over a year or more. But I think that people forget about like maybe the influence that he might have had on her, or the other way around. But I do think that their relationship, no matter what you think about how culpable Caril was or not, I think her relationship with Charlie was really integral to what unfolded. Both of them, you set this up at the beginning of the book, which is really interesting about their life histories. And they both had elements of their life histories and their personalities that drew them together in the first place. So I wanted to ask you if you had come to any conclusions about, or can talk about, how the relationship may have spurred Charlie to set this all in motion.
Well, Caril came from a convicted pedophile and a drunk and violent, and never was employed. She went to 6 different schools in 5 years, so she was a rough kid. I mean, and Charlie, and when she met Charlie, she was 12, which is, you have to keep in mind through all discussions of her that she was a child. And the jury, I mean, you couldn't get the world to do it back then because they saw her as a murderer. But what we know about children today and the level of brain development in a 12-year-old is pretty, they're not legal in the eyes of the law. They can't vote or buy alcohol or anything. And she was a child when she met Charlie. And you're right. He impacted her, and the theory that I've come up with the help of various psychologists is what they call kind of the sitting ducks theory, and it's usually a girl that has come from an abused family, an abusive situation, and needs to be cared for and focused on and number one in somebody's life. That's the feeling that she wants. Mm-hmm. And they're sitting ducks for somebody like Charlie. That's where the phrase comes from, because Charlie instinctively, in guys, can sense when a girl or a woman is in that situation where that's what they need. And it's how it's how women get into these entangled relationships that they can't get out of. Mm-hmm. Because the one thing the guy does is continually assure them that he loves them and that, she's the most important thing to him. And so that was kind of the beginning nature of the relationship.
Mm-hmm. You point this out, and I don't know that people know this. I think we make assumptions when we see something like this happen, and he was so young and he was so violent that we think, oh, he must have come from a very, horribly abusive background, or there must have been something, majorly off about his upbringing. But we don't see that. We see that his family was pretty, that he was close to his mother and his father, and he cared for them both very deeply. And he had good relationships with his siblings pretty much, and all of that. So he had that. But the problem that he had was being bullied. If you read any descriptions of him, he had several things that caused him to be bullied in school. But Caril accepted him, I think. So we have the person who wants to be rescued, and I think you have in Charlie the person who wants to be the hero. But that kind of spun out into something darker. Can you talk about that a little bit, about what Charlie's ideas were of how he was going to make a name for himself or become this hero in his own life, I guess?
Yeah, well, the bullying thing, just to explore that a little bit, he was 5'5". The average adult male was 5'8" in those days. And he had flaming red hair, thick flaming red hair that he got from his mother. And he was bow-legged and had a lisp. He got rid of the lisp eventually, but in his early school years, he was pretty bad looking character. And he was mocked viciously through his grade school years and into junior high, and did nothing about it really until one day he had a painting. He was a good painter. He had a painting that he made of his mother, and the kids were following him home from school and mocking him and all that. And one kid ripped the painting out of his hands and tore it up. And he went home, and his father said to him, "Look, from now on, don't take it. If they do something to you, hit him. And it was like that turned on a light in Charlie's head, and he became a fighter. I mean, my brother knew of the fights, and they were very, let's say they went beyond the normal schoolyard fights. Charlie would smack somebody in the mouth or the head, and they went down, and he would kick them or grind their face into the sand. So he soon gained a reputation as a very fearsome, cruel fighter, and he kind of lived in that reputation. It gave him a personality, gave him an identity. But his fiction, his fantasy was always to go out. He had no desire to live on a full life at all. He figured it was going to be a lousy life. He was going to be a garbage man. He would never get better than that. He wouldn't make it through high school probably. So he had this fantasy, which he'd always kind of had in one form or another, of being an outlaw and having an outlaw gang and getting into it with the sheriff and having a big shootout and going out in a blaze of glory. He's described it in detail. And what he needed to do was to move from his reality into the fantasy, and that's eventually what he did. What his fantasy was is what he brought into reality. The one thing he needed to make the fantasy work was to have a girl at his side. Every cowboy, has to have a girl as they go through the living of being an outlaw. And Caril fit that perfectly. She was young, she was cute, she was kind of mouthy herself, and his goal really was to show that he would kill for her and die for her. And this is pretty clear. And so that sets him up for the whole in my view. Now this is not the common understanding of Charlie's motivation in this. It's mine, and I'm pretty clear. I've had it looked at by people, and I think he was willing, if he could go out in a blaze of glory, he was willing to do it next month. He did not resist the electric chair. He was happy to go out. He thought, this will make me famous. The only regret he had, and Bruce Springsteen sung about it, was that he didn't have Caril sitting on his lap when they threw the switch.
That was a comment he made, right? Something.
Yeah, there was a great debate about who actually said that.
Oh, okay.
Some people said his father said it. Some people said his lawyer said it. I'm convinced he said it, but he didn't say "pretty baby" on my lap. He said, "I'll be happy to go to the chair if I can have Caril on my lap." Springsteen was the one who changed it to "pretty baby."
Yeah. More romantic that way, I guess.
Exactly.
Yeah. But, there's only one glitch in his, going out in a blaze of glory thing. It did culminate in that because on that road, that whole scene on the road where he's in Wyoming, he's now been, spotted, and there's this chase, there's a little bit of a shootout, whatever, but he gave himself up. So if you're going to go out in a blaze of glory, doesn't mean you go out in the blaze of glory. That was the only thing that I always thought, like, well, wait a minute. He didn't do what his whole fantasy, he basically cut that off at the knees because he didn't. He gave himself up.
He explained that by saying he was out of ammunition. And he told the cops, and who knows if it's true or not, he told the cops when they got him, if I'd had ammunition, I'd have shot you. We would have shot this thing out. And the fact was they did establish that he was out of ammunition. But, still, he could have waited until he was shot to death.
Yeah, he pointed the gun at them. They don't know he's out of ammunition. He's the only one that knows this.
Exactly.
Because he was alive, we have all of those photographs of him looking like this outlaw, right? While being taken in, bloody and handcuffed, and with the cigarette in his between his fingers, and then the trial, and then of course the execution. I mean, talk about if he really wanted to make a name for himself. That's something. If you're an outlaw, right? You're executed, and that's huge. Now, do you know what you said he didn't oppose it at all? Was he like Gary Gilmore, like a "let's do it" kind of attitude about going to the electric chair? Because it seems like that would be a pretty terrifying prospect.
The thing he feared was not the electric chair. The thing he feared was being classified as insane. and living his life out in a hospital. But he fought. His lawyers introduced an insanity defense over his objection. He and his family fought the insanity defense for one reason. He said nobody remembers a crazy man, and if he had to pick between the two of them, he would have definitely chosen the electric chair because that was a blaze of glory. But insanity, that's got no glory to it. That just means you're screwed up, in the terms of the day. You're crazy. Yeah. And he didn't want to go out crazy. It'd be much better to go out under the electrical charge.
That's pretty amazing that you're more concerned about the idea of people thinking about you as crazy, but not the fact that you were this brutal murderer that killed, men, women, and children, But I think to understand him a little bit more, you get a little bit more inside, his head, his words, everything that you were able to put together. And I think it does give us a different perspective of this case, which I really appreciated. But I wanted to ask you one last question. So was there anything that you found while researching this book that took you by surprise? Because like you said, you grew up in the area, you had heard the stories. And I was going to say something about that too, because I have a case on my mind that I want to write a book about that was from my hometown, which is a very small town here in the San Francisco Bay Area. But I know that goes two ways. One way is that it's good because you can picture it, you can see it, the feel, how it looks, everything to be able to set that story. But also, it can also maybe, I don't know, it's so local, it may, kind of prejudice you to some things, or maybe not prejudice, but come at it in a certain, vein, like you already have these ideas about it. So I just wanted to ask that. So while researching the book, was there anything that, kind of was like, wow, that's new to me. I didn't know about that, or this was surprising to me, or I never thought about that way. And if not that, what do you think that readers will find most surprising about your book, Starkweather?
Well, first of all, I like the idea when you read books written by an author who comes from the town, they have a different flavor to them. Absolutely. And it's always a good possibility because not only do you have the inside, or you're looking from the inside, but you have ways of describing it which are going to be unique to your perspective. The bias, first of all, I had no bias going into it. I went away to prep school and then college and law school, and I came in as a neutral. And wherever the facts led me was where I was prepared to go. I just wanted it to be proven one way or another, substantially proven. And so I ended up going down that path. The one thing that surprised me that shocked me, to tell you the truth, didn't really relate to the guilt or innocence of Caril. The only evidence against her was Charlie's testimony, which is worthless, and a statement that she gave after being interrogated for 7 or 8 hours. But the thing in this whole story that shocked me the most was that the investigators, the law, made a serious mistake early on in the Charlie had killed somebody in late November of 1957, a gas station attendant by the name of Robert Colvert. 7 weeks later was when he started the spree. So you have 7 weeks in there where he's on the loose. Nobody made the connection. There was a connection. And if the connection had been found by the police, Charlie would have been arrested. 10 people would have had their lives to live out. Right. And I can develop that a little bit. There was a fellow by the name of Robert McClung that worked out at the gas station where Charlie often slept. He got kicked out of his flat for not paying his rent. He'd take his car, he'd drive his 49 Ford out to the gas station and spend all night there sleeping. And they got to know Robert McClung, kind of. And so when they were investigating the murder of the gas station attendant, they came across Charlie because the two attendants said, yeah, we got this guy here. They didn't know his name. So you can see it in the notes. We got a red-headed guy driving a 49 Ford that we would like to find. 2 or 3 different investigators. Had they asked Robert McLean, where does he work?
Mm-hmm.
Because Robert McLean woke him up every morning at 4:30 because he had to go on his brother's garbage route.
Mm-hmm.
And McLean told him, I woke him up every morning at 4:30 to go to work. Had they said, do you know what he did? He would have said garbage man.
Yeah.
There were 3 garbage companies in Lincoln in 1958. They would have found Charlie probably in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And he would have been taken into custody. There were other corroboration, and the whole story would really not have happened.
Wow. Yeah. And he's pretty recognizable. I don't think it would be that hard to find him, right?
No, and Lincoln was a small town. The cops, he hadn't been arrested and photographed, but they knew who he was. He was a character in town. He was a hot rodder and a greaser and all that stuff. And they could have put it together if they had talked amongst themselves. Because was a lady in the thrift store said, yeah, there was this kid who came in, red hair, short, bow-legged, and he was spending all sorts of change. Well, Charlie, $10 worth of silver, which Charlie had got from the gas station. Had they ever connected the redhead that was out at the gas station that Robert McClung talked about with this lady, they would have put that together, that he was the guy, and probably tracked him down.
That is surprising, because it wasn't just like it was a robbery, it was a murder, so why wouldn't you be seriously looking for this person? Or, and like you said, it seems like you could have connected the dots very easily to find him. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's law enforcement back in those days in small Midwestern towns was pretty crude. When you look at things that they did and things that they didn't do, around these horrible crime scenes, there was no tape, no yellow tape, no crime scene tape. People got into the house of the family's murders and took photographs. Just people walking by, walked in the middle of the investigation, walked off with evidence. It's quite startling to see, but they didn't have any homicides either. They had like 1 homicide a year.
Yeah.
So you're not going to staff for 15. It was a real kind of a simple situation in that time.
Yeah, it's funny because we think about this, people that, consume these true crime stories as shows and, podcasts and read books and everything. And you always think about that when you say, well, wait a minute, what happened to the investigation? How come they didn't do this? How come they didn't do that? But people are thinking sometimes on the bigger term, they're thinking about the police departments in bigger cities. And then they have these whole, homicide division and all this stuff. But a lot of crimes take place in small towns where they don't have those kind of resources. And they might have one person who's, assigned to deal with homicide, but whether or not they're trained or how much they're trained or how many resources they have, it can be very limited. So we never think about that. We always think of, oh, well, wait a minute, where was the DNA and where was the, the fingerprint expert and the, whatever. And it's not necessary that you have those things. You have one person maybe or two who maybe are not that well trained and go in and they have to analyze this whole crime. It would be like me going in, maybe a little bit better than that, but, going in and trying to look at a crime scene or investigate and, where do you even start? So, I think it's interesting to read a book like yours and get to the details of it and then say, oh, wait a minute. Okay, well, that makes more sense that, that this happened this way, or we don't know about this, or here's some conclusions we can come to, because you really have to look and drill down at the details. And of course, as challenging as I'm sure it was to, research this case and find the truth, because there's a lot of, like you said, lore out there about it, it had to be a big challenge. But I think you've done a fabulous job, because there's quite a bit in here that I think will be surprising to readers that they didn't know about this case. And if, they're younger and haven't heard about this case at all, well, then they've got quite a treat to, to learn about it. And I'm sure they can ask their parents, and they wait a minute, you never heard of what are you talking about? You never heard of Charles Starkweather or this case?
Yeah.
There's a lot of new readers out there. I'm sure that they're going to find this very, very interesting. I know I did, and I thought I knew the case.
Well, how old are you?
I am today. I am 59.
And when did you first remember hearing about this case?
I would say it was probably from your book, In Broad Daylight, to be honest. And that came out, what year did that come out?
That came out in 89,
Okay.
88.
I was going to say the
88.
80s. I believe it was the 80s. And yeah, I think that's probably when I learned about it. So that was already, what, 30 years? Yeah, 30
Yeah.
years. Wow. So
It's being passed down, but it's one of these generations that's going to move into history. Although I thought that about In Broad Daylight too, that killing was going to move into history. It's still the reverberates today.
yeah.
You know, when you go into that small town, and you go into Lincoln today, and you talk to people in their 60s or 70s, they still have very firm opinions about Caril's guilt to this day, and some of them are quite angry about it.
Yeah, yeah. And that to me, it's one of those things that I never did come to a conclusion about it. And the thing was the first thing was the killing of her family, and especially her baby sister. Like I'm like,
God, that was hard to write. That was
oh, God,
terrible
it
to
was
write.
horrible. And I thought, no, I can't see her being there. I don't think she was there. And I don't think after knowing that, if she did know about it, I mean, at some point she had to know about it. Oh, I know. There was one last question.
Yes.
One last question I was going to ask you. I know that early on, everybody thought Caril was probably a victim too, because she was just gone, right? Yeah. When did people start to think, well, Caril's guilty too? How far into this, did people start to change their opinions about her?
Very, very early, the DA, the county attorney, and the police chief were convinced early on that she was involved, and I think that what led them to conclude that was that Charlie and Caril spent 5 days in the house with the bodies in the back in some sheds behind the house, frozen, and that because of that Caril stayed there and kind of hung out with Charlie before they fled. They figured that she was into it. But when she was arrested in Wyoming, they had already filed two murder charges against her. So wow. they were convinced early on, and they stuck with it. And it's just as an aside, if she had been acquitted of the charge that she was convicted of, they had 9 other murders ready to go. They were going to go through them one after another till they got her.
Wow. That's surprising because of her, that she was a female and also her age, that right away that they pegged her as being complicit. But I think you talk about that a little bit in the book too, just the perception of her, coming from, say, right. the wrong side of the tracks kind of thing, or, however you want to right. phrase it. Yeah, there's definitely that little bit of a bias there. Like, okay, if she had been, like Caril King, a girl like Caril King, one of the victims, it probably would have been different. She was, this wholesome girl, absolutely. I guess, or it's a different perception, and we still see that today. The way that people are perceived, even when they're victims, it depends on how people decide what kind of person they are, what kind of life they live.
And what ties into that is the class that they're in. That's what was new to me. The economic class
yes.
that they're in affects the way they're perceived. And when you have a girl who is from basically a poor kind of area of town, what they would call white trash, she's in a bad place to start with. Their perception of her in those days was not good. Was not good to start with, and they kind of piled on her because they figured, well, she had to be having sex with Charlie, and it kind of kept on going from there. But kind of the basis of it was both her sex and her class, which was interesting.
Right, and definitely people have to remember the times. It was 1958, so a female in 1958, you have to be a certain way traditionally, especially a girl that age. You don't smoke, you don't swear, you don't have sex, you don't, all those kind of things. So it gives the people, a lot to decide. Well, she had to be part of this or whatever. But yeah, it's interesting to read this because now you can maybe pull that apart in light of today and light of her life. And then decide, what do you think? What do you believe? So that's very interesting. I could talk to you all day about this because I just find this so fascinating, just the human aspect of it and just the psychology behind it and motivations and all that stuff. But I just want to thank you once again for being on the show. And I definitely recommend the book. It's out now. I mean, I had a copy, so I got to read it, but I know it's out now, so listeners can find it. And also, I will put a link to your website, but I'm sure the book is out everywhere, correct?
Correct. Yeah, it's It better be at this point. Hey, so is this really your birthday?
Yes, today's my birthday, December 5th.
Well, happy birthday.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. Coming from one of my favorite authors, that made my day. Thank you so much.
Well,
So,
thanks for having me on your show.
yeah, thank you so much. And, all the best with the book. I'm sure it's going to do fabulous. I'm reading it now. I haven't quite finished it, but I definitely am into it. And like I said, highly recommend it. So thank you once again. It was an honor and a pleasure to talk to you. And good luck in any future endeavors and with this book for sure.
Thank you very much. I
Okay.
enjoyed talking to you. I
You
really
too.
did.
Once again, I'd like to thank my guest, author Harry McLean, for his insights into this fascinating true crime case from history. You can purchase Starkweather at all major bookstores, on Amazon.com, and through Harry's website, harrymaclean.com. It is also available in digital form and as an audiobook. Links are in the show notes. If you'd like to listen to my episode about this case, you can find it in Season 1, Episode 32, Sweetheart Killers, Charles Starkweather and Caril Fugate. There's one more episode of Once Upon a Crime before we close 2023. Next week, catch episode number 307, where I'll give my 2023 true crime wrap-up. What cases caught my attention the most this year? What milestones did Once Upon a Crime reach in 2023? And what were the true crime stories your other favorite podcasters were obsessed with this year? Find out next week on Once Upon a Crime. Once Upon a Crime is written and produced by me, Esther Sanchez Ludlow. My administrative and production assistant is Lorena Garcia. Until next time, be good to one another.